You're here now. The day is done. The noise has passed. And whatever you carried, you can set it down for a while. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts begin to wander, not to worry, but to wonder. Because tonight, we're going back. Back to the edge of the desert. Back to tents and firelight and skies untouched by light. Back to when the story was only just beginning. Before there were kings. Before the tablets. Before there was Israel or a chosen people. There was one man, alone, listening. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't young. He didn't carry a sword or command an army. He didn't ask to be called. But he heard something, and he followed. Not because he had answers, but because he had hope. His name was Abram, and later Abraham. But tonight, we're not rushing to who he became. Tonight, we walk with him as he was. A wanderer, a husband, a dreamer, a believer in something he couldn't yet see. You may be tired. You may be anxious. You may feel far from where you're meant to be. So did he. This story is not about arrival. It's about the journey, the quiet one, the long one, the one filled with stars and silence and promises whispered across impossible distances. It's a story about trust, not when things are certain, but when they're not. And if you've ever been unsure, if you've ever felt small beneath a sky too wide, if you've ever waited longer than you thought you could, then this story is for you. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the air around you settle, and picture a desert, an old man standing barefoot beneath the stars, a voice, gentle, patient, calling him forward. This is where it begins. Before the journey, there was silence, and in the silence, a voice. Abram was not young, but he was not finished either. He lived in the long pause between seasons, too far from youth to dream recklessly, but not yet near the end to let go. He stood in that middle stretch of a man's life when he has built many things, but still waits for the thing that matters most. He was a man of substance. His name held weight in the city of Ur. His flocks were counted in the hundreds, his tents spread across wide pastures, and his servants spoke of him with respect. Neighbors nodded when he passed. Markets quieted as he entered. People knew him. But Abram didn't feel known, not truly, because while his hands were full, his heart still hungered. Ur was a land of order and excess. The ziggurats rose like stairways to the sky, painted in lapis and fire. The temples were loud, fragrant with oil and incense. Gods with gilded eyes and stone mouths watched over every corner. People prayed, performed, and poured their hopes into statues and coins and flames. Abram saw all of it, but he remained still. He went through the motions. He nodded at the rituals. He observed the customs. But in his quiet, in the corners of his thoughts, he wondered, is this it? Is this all that the heavens are? Stone faces and empty hands. Some nights, after the city had dimmed, Abram would slip away. He'd leave the crowded lanes and rise into the hills, past the firelight, past the sound of sheep, past the voices that talked too much and said too little. There, where the sand cooled and the world held its breath, he'd find a flat place and lie back in the grass, and he would listen to nothing and to everything. The sky above him would swell with stars, millions upon millions flickering and silent, as if each one carried a secret, and though he could never name them, he felt as though they had always known his name. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stared upward and waited, without knowing what for. Then one night, something happened. Not a sound, not at first, not even a breeze. But something in the air changed. It was as if the stars leaned closer, as if the world itself had drawn a breath. And then, the voice came. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It didn't tear through the sky or shake the ground. It came softly, quietly, from somewhere deep. Not just around him, but within him. A voice that did not ask, but invited. A voice that didn't overwhelm, but awakened. It spoke not in riddles, but in a single word that carried everything. Go. Go. Leave. Step away from all you've built, from your father's house, from the land of your birth, from the patterns you've memorized, to a place I will show you. Not now, not fully, but soon. A land, a future, a promise. Abram sat up slowly. He looked around as though expecting someone to be standing near him. But there was no one. Just stars, just wind, just silence. Yet he had never felt less alone, because something had reached into the very center of him, and it had touched trust. He stood, and for the first time in his life he didn't feel bound by the land beneath him. He felt called by something beyond it. The next morning, he didn't run into the city declaring visions. He didn't demand altars or witnesses. He simply began to prepare. Quietly, he rolled up rugs, counted camels, sorted grain. He woke the servants before sunrise. He spoke to them in calm tones, issuing instructions that sounded practical, even ordinary. But every step was a step away from comfort, and towards something unknown. Then he turned to Sarai. She was awake already. Of course she was. She always noticed when his breath changed in the night. She looked at him, studied his face, and said nothing. He said only, "We're leaving." She nodded. Not because she understood, not because she saw what he saw, but because her trust in him was old and quiet and deep. She began to pack. Lot came too, the nephew he'd raised like a son. He asked questions, of course, about roads, water, danger, direction. Abram didn't have answers, just a voice and a sky and a promise. That was enough. So they walked. They left behind them. The towers, the markets, the gods with gold-plated names. They crossed rivers, past ruins, watched the land stretch wider and wilder before them. And each night, when the camp was quiet, Abram would step away. He would stand beneath the stars again and wonder how many steps remained, and remind himself he was not walking alone. The land behind them disappeared slowly, not in a single moment, not in a single goodbye, but step by step, camp by camp, day by day, until its temples, its voices, its familiar rhythms, was only a story they carried in their bones. Abram walked at the front of the caravan. His steps were deliberate, never rushed, never restless. Each pace a quiet conversation between foot and earth, between man and God. There was no map in his hand, no glowing sign, no promise of a destination carved in stone. Only a voice he could still feel, and a sky that refused to stay silent. Behind him followed dozens, men, women, children, camels, flasks of water, sacks of barley, linen stretched across the backs of pack animals, tired feet, quiet songs, soft complaints spoken only once and then swallowed by the wind. And somewhere near the center rode Sarai. She did not speak often. She didn't need to. Her presence steadied the others. If she could leave her home, if she could wear the same robe day after day, if she could press her lips into a line and keep going, then so could they. But the road was long, and so was the waiting. The first weeks were filled with the thrill of motion, of waking up in a different place than the night before, of new trees, new rivers, new birds whose calls were strange and echoing. But then came the middle, the part of every journey where excitement fades and distance remains. The dust clung thicker. The food had fewer spices. The waterskins needed mending. And the sky, while still beautiful, became familiar enough that no one bothered to point. Sarai missed silence. Not the silence of deserts, but the silence of her old courtyard. The rustle of fig leaves against sun-warmed walls. The hush of oil being poured into clay lamps. The stillness of not being looked at. Out here she was watched, not with judgment, but with expectation. She was Sarai, wife of Abram, the man who heard God, the man who left everything, the man who had no answers, and yet everyone followed. And she was the woman who followed him. Some nights she wanted to scream, not in anger, but because there was nowhere to put her questions. She had them, of course. Why now? Why them? Why leave behind what others only dream to build? But she never asked aloud, because Sarai was proud, and Sarai loved him, and Sarai believed. Even when her belief ached like a bruise she didn't want bandaged, Abram knew. Of course he did. He knew her silence. He knew when her glances meant I'm tired. He knew when her stillness meant I'm afraid. He did not lecture her with promises. He did not repeat what the voice had said. He simply held her hand when they walked, built fires for her at camp before his own, watched the stars at night and spoke the names of distant hopes out loud, quietly, so only she could hear. And she listened. Even when she didn't understand, she listened. Because love isn't loud on the road. It's found in carrying water, in repairing a sandal, in laughing once, only once, at the same tired story, and in not leaving, even when you don't know where you're going. One afternoon, they reached a wide, empty plain. The grass grew knee-high and swayed like an ocean. There was no water in sight, but the ground was firm and the wind gentle. Abram decided to stop. The camp was set, the tents unfurled, fires lit. Children ran in circles until their laughter tangled with the grass. And Sarai, rather than sitting by the fire or retreating to the tent, walked, alone. She wandered until the edge of the camp disappeared, until the sound of others dimmed to nothing, until the only sound left was her own breath and the low hum of a land untouched. She tilted her head back. The sky above her was enormous, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel watched. She didn't feel followed. She didn't feel needed. She just felt real. When Abram found her, she didn't turn. He stood a few paces behind her, silent. "I miss the olive trees," she said, without looking back. He nodded. "I miss the market smells," she added. He stepped forward. "I miss the sound of the fountain at night." They stood side by side. Then she turned to him. Her face was calm, but her eyes were searching. "Do you really believe there's a land for us?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down and plucked a wildflower growing from the ground. He held it out to her. "It's growing here where no one planted it," he said. "That's enough for me." She took it and said nothing more. That night, Abram built an altar. He gathered stones, not polished ones, just the ones that fit together. He stacked them quietly as the sun dipped beneath the plains and the sky turned copper and then black. He lit a flame at the center, and as the others gathered near to eat, to sleep, to sit, Sarai sat beside him. She didn't bow her head. She didn't pray. She just held the flower in her lap and watched the stars burn above them like eyes that never blinked. Some nights, when the wind was too strong or the goats too restless, Sarai would lie awake. She would watch Abram as he slept, his chest rising slow, his brow calm. his hand always near hers, and she would whisper things she didn't say during the day. I'm tired. I miss the olive trees. I don't know if this will ever be home. But in the morning, she would rise first, and the others would see her strength, and the camp would move forward. Because if Sarai could walk, so could they. The land before them stretched like a breath that had never fully exhaled, rolling hills melting into the horizon, dry valleys pressed low under golden light, and trees that leaned gently in the wind, whispering to no one. Abram stood quietly among it all, his eyes soft with silence. There were no crowds here, no towers, no altars carved from marble, only dirt, wind, and stars. And for the first time in weeks, the world felt like it was listening. Their camp had settled beside a cluster of ancient oaks. It was the kind of place that didn't speak loudly, but offered peace to those who stopped long enough to hear it. Sarai laid the rugs herself that evening, her hands moving with care. She wasn't in a hurry. There was something sacred about stillness here, and she pressed it into each fold of fabric as though smoothing the creases out of a memory. The animals settled without fuss. The servants worked in calm rhythm. Even the fire breathed quietly, its glow painting long shadows across the tents. When night finally wrapped around the camp like a woolen cloak, Abram slipped away. He walked without a torch. The stars were enough. The wind greeted him first, brushing past his shoulders as if to say, "This is yours." The earth cooled beneath his feet, the grass giving way beneath each step. He didn't count the distance. He simply walked until the noise of the camp dissolved behind him. Ahead, the sky opened wider, unbroken, and filled with points of light. Abram stood in the quiet, breathing in the scent of ash and cedar that drifted from distant campfires. He lifted his eyes and saw them, stars beyond number, scattered across the heavens like 1,000 gentle promises waiting to be remembered. And in that stillness, the voice returned. Not a shout, not a thunderclap, just a name. Abram. Spoken like a friend, familiar, software steady. He didn't move. He didn't need to, because he knew this voice now, not with his ears, but with something older, something deeper. It didn't arrive from the sky, but from within. A voice that didn't echo across mountains, but resonated through marrow. A voice that spoke not of orders, but of invitation. "Lift your eyes," it said, and he did. He had already been looking, but now he truly saw. "Count the stars if you can." He smiled at that. He tried. 1, 2, 8, a dozen. He lost count. They were endless, and that was the point. The voice continued, low and steady. "So shall your offspring be." Abram didn't answer. He couldn't. Something caught in his chest, too wide for words, too soft for explanation. There, under the stars, with nothing but earth and night to witness, he believed. Not with his mind, not with logic, but with something older than both. He believed like someone remembering a truth they'd always known. Then the voice went on, gentle as moonlight. "I brought you out from Ur. I led you here. I will give this land to your descendants." And here, for the first time, Abram asked something back, not out of rebellion, not out of fear, but out of wonder. "How will I know?" Not will you, not can you. Just how? A man can walk a long road with hope, but even the faithful ask to see the horizon every once in a while. And the voice, God, did not scold him. He answered with presence. The air shifted. The grass seemed to stand taller. Abram looked around. The moment had weight. not the weight of burden, but of glory. He knelt and began to gather stones, not polished ones, but nearby, common, uneven. Each chosen one by one. Each placed slowly. He was not building for show. He was building to remember. An altar rose from the dirt, not tall, not grand, but holy. He lit a small flame. It danced in the stillness. This would mark it, this night, this place, this promise, not with trumpets, not with carved letters, but with light and memory. When he returned to the tent, Sarai was still awake. She sat just inside the flap, arms wrapped in a shawl, her eyes watching him before he even came into view. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She knew. They sat side by side on the edge of the rug. The firelight flickered across their hands. She turned her head slightly and asked, "Did he speak again?" He nodded. "And," she said. He looked out through the flap, back toward the field, back toward the stars. "There are too many to count," he whispered. And after a moment, she smiled. Not wide, but long. She rested her head against his shoulder and replied, "Then let's stop trying to understand and just keep walking." The rains faded, first as a whisper, then as an absence. The mornings became brittle. The soil beneath their feet grew hard, cracked like dry lips waiting for a drink. Dust clung to the corners of the tents. The grass withered in patches until the sheep no longer grazed, but searched. And the people, once energized by the journey, the call, the stars, began to walk slower, speak less, worry more. A famine had come, not the kind that arrives in a single storm, but the kind that creeps in gently and then does not leave. The kind that makes people look to the skies and say, perhaps tomorrow, for days and days that never change. Abram did not panic, but Sarai could see it in the quiet places of his face. How often his eyes scanned the horizon. How frequently he watched the skies not for stars, but for clouds. He ate less, paced more. The confidence that had carried them from through forests and plains, across rivers and hills, now walked beside a quieter companion. Concern. They had heard of Egypt. It was the land beyond the border, a place spoken of in distant fireside stories, a place where water never ran dry, where grain was stored in towers, where famine did not come as a stranger, but was met with preparation. The Nile flowed even when the rest of the world cracked. In Egypt, there was bread. And so, with gentle instruction, Abram packed the camp once more. They rolled the rugs, they gathered the herds, and they turned their feet southward toward the land of provision. Egypt was everything the wilderness was not. Where Canaan was quiet, Egypt was filled with noise. Where the roads had once been wind and rock, now they were paved with polished stones. The city walls reached toward the sky, adorned with color and gold. There were crowds in the markets, music in the streets, the scent of spices, and the flash of garments dyed with colors Sarai had never seen before. Here, the people did not wonder if the earth would provide. They were certain it would. To the eyes of the tired travelers, it was dazzling. But behind that awe, Sarai felt a quiet tightening in her chest. She noticed how the guards looked at her as they entered the city gates. Their eyes lingered, not with reverence, not with curiosity, but with calculation. She noticed how quickly the servants whispered when she passed, how merchants turned their heads not toward Abram, but toward her, and she saw in her husband's expression that he noticed it too. That evening, after the camp was settled outside the city walls, Abram came to her quietly. The fire between them flickered low, casting long shadows. "They will ask about you," he said carefully. His voice wasn't cold, but cautious. Sarai sat still. "I know," she replied. He hesitated, then spoke again. "If they learn that you are my wife, they may take you. They may kill me." Sarai did not blink. "Say you are my sister." There was no malice in his voice, no manipulation, just fear, raw and unadorned. She looked at him then. This man she had followed across silence and dust. This man who had counted stars and built altars. The man who had once walked in faith, now speaking from a place of uncertainty. And yet, she did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She only nodded once. Her trust, even bruised, still chose him. What happened next unfolded quickly. Word of her beauty passed like flame through straw. Eyes followed her in the marketplace. Voices carried her name through the halls. It wasn't long before the messengers of Pharaoh arrived, dressed in white and adorned with gold. They came with compliments, with offerings, with instructions. She was to be brought to the palace, not as a captive, no, not in chains, but as a guest, a jewel, a woman to be honored. To Pharaoh, she was not a person. She was a prize. And Sarai went because she had said she would. Pharaoh lavished Abram with gifts, sheep and oxen, camels and servants, silver coins in tied pouches. They arrived in carts, in baskets, in generous waves. The camp flourished outwardly, but inwardly something had faded. Abram held grain in his hands, but felt emptier than when they had gone hungry. Sarai's absence was a silence louder than any famine. He no longer walked in prayer. He no longer stood beneath the stars. He simply waited, and that waiting stung more than hunger. In the palace, Sarai moved like a ghost in silk. She was not mistreated. The food was rich, the rooms filled with perfume. She was offered jewels and robes, attendance and comfort. But none of it mattered. At night, she sat at the edge of her chamber window, looking not at the courtyards below, but at the sky above, at the stars she and Abram had once counted together. Her hands folded, her lips moved, though no one heard her prayers. They were not long, just soft. Remember me. Remember him. Remember us. The land beneath their feet had changed, not in color or contour, but in mood. It was full, rich, alive, abundant. The rains had returned in quiet rhythms, coaxing green from dry places. The flocks had multiplied, heavy with new lambs. The ground no longer cracked. It yielded. Every day there was more to tend, more to manage, more to share. But with blessing often comes burden. And though the land gave freely, the people began to tense. Abram noticed it first in the eyes of the herdsmen. Glances turned cautious. Conversations shortened. Then the quiet murmurs turned into territorial voices. Arguments over water, over grazing space, over whose fire should be lit first. The men avoided each other now, not in fear, but in frustration. Lot's herds had grown just as much as Abram's. What began as a shared journey, a single household, one vision, one direction, had become two. Two encampments traveling together, two groups, not one, two ambitions. And Abram felt it, quietly, like a splinter under the skin. Sarai saw it in other ways. She watched how Lot moved, his stride longer, his tone louder. He made more decisions now without seeking Abram's input. He spoke to his servants with the confidence of someone becoming something else. Not a nephew, not a follower, but a man staking claim. He was growing, and with that growth came edges. Abram said nothing. He didn't confront. He didn't correct. He waited. Until one morning, when the sun had barely risen and the dew still clung to the grass, he sent word to Lot. They walked to a high ridge just west of the Jordan. The valley below stretched like a painting, lush, watered, glistening with the soft sheen of early light. It was a good land, a generous land. It promised much to those who settled it. They stood there together for a long while, neither speaking. Finally, Abram turned, his voice as steady as it had been the night they left Ur. "Let there be no strife between us," he said, "between your herdsmen and mine, for we are kin. Is not the whole land before us?" He gestured across the valley, his hand sweeping from horizon to horizon. "If you take the left, I will go right. If you choose the right, I will go left." There was no anger in his words, only surrender, not to Lot, but to peace. Lot looked across the land. He didn't hesitate. He saw the Jordan Valley, green, fertile, crowded with possibilities. The grass rolled thick across the lowlands, rivers braided through orchards and plains. It looked like Eden, like Egypt, like the kind of land one could build something permanent upon. Lot pointed to the east. "I will go there. No thank you, no ceremony, just decision." He turned and walked away. And that was the last time they stood side by side. Abram didn't follow with his eyes. He looked instead to the horizon behind them, the land that remained. It wasn't as green, it wasn't as easy, but it was his. He returned to Sarai with calm steps. He chose the east, he said simply. Sarai, who had watched from afar, nodded. She didn't ask questions. She only reached for his hand and walked with him back to their tent. Because not all victories are loud, and not all losses are defeat. Sometimes the truest strength is found in the letting go. The days that followed were quiet. Without the tension, the camp seemed to breathe. The argument stopped. The herds moved with ease. Even the wind through the trees sounded softer. Abram found himself walking more, among the hills, through the groves, by the edge of streams. He was lighter now, not because he had more, but because he had chosen less. He had not clung, he had not fought, and somehow that had made room for something sacred. Then one evening, beneath the soft glow of twilight, the voice returned. Abram stood near the edge of the same ridge, his eyes on the same sky. The stars had not changed, but he had. "Lift your eyes," the voice said. And so he did. Look north, south, east, west. The land spread before him, vast and silent. All of it. "I will give to you and to your descendants forever." Abram's breath caught. He hadn't asked for more, but more had come. "And I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth," God continued, "so that if one could count the dust, your children would be counted also." Abram looked down at the dirt beneath his feet. He let it fall through his fingers. Dust. Common, ordinary, everywhere. And yet, immeasurable. He smiled. Because the promise had once been in stars. Now it was in soil. He didn't need to understand. He only needed to trust. He moved the camp once more, this time to the great trees of Mamre near Hebron. The land there was open and firm. The shade from the oak stretched long across the ground, and the wind sang through the branches like breath through a harp. And there, again, he built an altar, stone by stone, slow, quiet, intentional. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because there are moments when gratitude builds its own home. He lit the flame and watched it flicker upward. No crowds, no trumpet, no vision this time. Just fire and sky and presence, and a man who had chosen peace over possession and found promise instead. Some promises are whispered, others are carved in night. The days passed gently beneath the oaks of Mumbre. The sun rose slowly here. The mornings unfolded like scrolls, cool mist across the grass, birds announcing the dawn in staggered song, and the distant bleating of lambs too young to know anything but hunger. The camp moved at a steady rhythm now. There was no tension, no need to rush. Abram's people worked with quiet hands and spoke in low voices. It was a season of rest. But inside Abram, there was still waiting. The land was his now. The skies had confirmed it. His feet walked across ground promised by the voice. He had built altars, led people, chosen peace. He had done everything asked of him. But the one thing, the one hope, had not yet come. He had no child. The promise had been clear. Your descendants will be like the stars, like the dust. But Sarai's womb remained silent. Month after month, year after year. Her strength remained. Her laughter still warmed the campfires. But her body gave no sign of new life. And though Abram never questioned her love, he sometimes wondered if the promise was slipping further out of reach. One night, he stood again beneath the stars. The fire in the camp had died low, leaving only embers and shadow. He walked alone, past the outer tents, past the line of tethered camels, past the hill of stones where his last altar stood. The sky above him was vast again, a velvet canopy of light. But this time, it felt quiet in a different way, like something was coming. And then the voice returned, not loud, not sudden, just present. Abram. He inhaled. He answered with silence. I am your shield, the voice said, your very great reward. But Abram, for the first time, spoke back with weight. O Lord God, what will you give me? I still have no child. The one who will inherit everything is Eliezer of Damascus. There was no anger in his voice, just ache. He looked up, as if hoping to see an answer written across the stars. You have given me no offspring, he continued, his voice quieter now. So a servant will be my heir. And God replied, not with rebuke, not with disappointment, but with clarity. This man will not be your heir. Abram's heart paused. Your own son, your very flesh and blood, will come from you, and he shall inherit everything. Then the voice said what it had said once before. Look up. So Abram lifted his eyes. The stars waited. Count them, the voice whispered again. If you can. He didn't try this time. He just stood beneath them. He let the starlight soak into his skin like oil. He let the vastness press into him, not as fear, but as promise. So shall your descendants be. And there, in the open, under 1,000 burning suns, Abram believed. The night deepened, and God said more. I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur, to give you this land to possess. Abram, bolder now in faith, but still human, asked softly, O Lord, how will I know that I shall possess it? Not out of doubt, but because he wanted to hold onto the thread of this moment forever. And the voice, instead of fading, answered with mystery. Bring me a heifer, God said, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, also a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abram didn't ask why. He simply obeyed. He gathered the animals one by one, chose them carefully, healthy, whole, without blemish. He brought them to a quiet place, a stretch of dry ground beneath a low hill. He prepared them the way tradition instructed, cutting each in two, laying the halves opposite each other, but not the birds, those he left whole. He waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then began to fall. The sky grew orange, then grey, then deepened into violet. Abram sat in silence beside the offering. Vultures circled overhead. One landed nearby, wings beating against dust. Abram stood, waved them off with a branch, then sat again. The birds left, but the silence remained. And then, as the final edge of light left the sky, sleep came. But not an ordinary sleep. This was a heavy, sacred darkness, a stillness that felt like time itself had slowed. A dread fell upon him, not terror, but reverence, the weight of presence, the weight of knowing something eternal was near. And then God came, not with form, but with voice. Know this, Abram. Your descendants will be strangers in a land not their own. They will be servants there. They will suffer for 400 years, but they will not be forgotten. I will bring them out with great possessions. They will return to this land. I will deal with those who oppress them. And you will go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. And then came the fire, a smoking brazier, a torch burning bright, passed between the pieces of the offering. No one held it. It moved on its own, slow, reverent, glowing. The flame danced across the blood-soaked earth, weaving between sacrifice and soil, sealing something unseen. And in that moment, the covenant was made, not in words alone, but in action, in flame, in darkness, in belief. When Abram awoke, the stars still watched him, but something in the air had shifted. The land was quiet. The wind had paused, and Abram knew. This promise was not just spoken. It was bound, carved in stars, cut in earth, sealed in fire. When time stretches longer than belief, and hearts try to hurry God, the days grew long, not in toil, not in distance, but in delay. The promise hung in the air like perfume, faint, lingering, undeniable. The words had been spoken, the stars had been counted, the altar had been built. The vision had come in darkness and fire, but time moved slowly, and wombs remained still. Sarai felt it first, not as anger, but as erosion. Every morning she awoke to the same silence within her. She watched the women in the camp, some younger, some newly married, carrying life inside their bodies like a secret song. Bellies rounded, eyes glowed, laughter flowed from their tents like warm bread. There were lullabies being hummed to babies still unborn. And Sarai smiled, always smiled. But in the quiet hours, when the fire had gone low and Abram slept beside her, she wept into her cloak. Not loud, never loud, just enough. She remembered the voice. She remembered the stars. She believed in the promise. But what do you do with a promise? That won't bloom. How long must a heart stretch before it tears? Sarai was strong. She had crossed deserts, followed blindly, slept on sand, walked beside a man who listened to voices she could not hear. She had given up the city for the camp, the palace for the field. She had believed, but her body had not followed. Abram never blamed her. He loved her fiercely, still, always. He never turned his eyes toward other women, never whispered disappointment, never suggested she was the problem. But she saw it in him, in his quiet glances, in his prayers that grew longer at night, in the way he lingered by the children of others. He didn't say it, but he hoped. And Sarai slowly began to feel like the one standing in the way of his joy. One morning, before the camp stirred, she rose early and walked the length of the sleeping tents. She found Hagar there, tending the water skins, kneeling near the animals, her movements quiet and precise. Hagar was young, Egyptian, quick with her hands and thoughtful with her gaze. A servant who had never asked questions, only followed. Sarai watched her for a long moment, and then, with the kind of calm that can only come from deep inner storms, she spoke. "Abram," she said later that day, "the Lord has kept me from bearing children." He looked at her, uncertain. He sensed something coming. "Go into my servant," she continued. "Perhaps I shall obtain a child through her." Abram was quiet. It wasn't lust that stirred in him. It was confusion. He loved Sarai. He trusted her. But he also knew the ache she carried and the toll it had taken. He agreed. Hagar was brought into the tent that night. No celebration, no candles, just obedience. And not long after, she conceived. At first, Sarai watched from a distance. She observed the way Hagar walked differently, stood straighter, the way her hand drifted to her stomach when she thought no one was looking. Sarai said nothing, but something inside her twisted. This had been her idea, her solution, her strategy, and it had worked, but it did not feel like victory. Hagar began to change. She was still obedient, still served, but her eyes began to harden. Her words grew fewer. She looked at Sarai differently now, not with malice, but with something colder. Pity. And that broke Sarai. Jealousy is a bitter root. Even when born of sorrow, even when fed by loss, Sarai snapped. She went to Abram and poured out her frustration. Her words came sharp, faster than she had meant. "She looks at me with contempt." Abram listened. "She's your servant," he said gently. "Do with her as you see right." Sarai returned to the tent with her chin high. She was not cruel, but she was firm. She reminded Hagar of her place, her role, her origin, her station, and Hagar fled. She ran far, past the outer tents, past the trees, past the grazing fields, until the camp was a memory behind her, and the wilderness stretched before her like an open wound. She didn't stop until the water skins were empty, and her strength had withered into breathless sobs. And there, near a spring, somewhere in the desert between escape and despair, she collapsed. But heaven was watching, and a messenger came, not in fire, not in thunder, but in presence. "Hagar," he said, "servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She lifted her eyes, red with sand and tears. "I am fleeing from my mistress." The voice did not scold. It did not shame. It said simply, "Return, submit, and I will multiply your offspring beyond number." She stared. A promise. For her? But the voice continued, "You will bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction." And there, in the wilderness, something new was spoken into being. Not just a child, but a name for God. She whispered it aloud, her voice cracking. "You are the God who sees me." She returned, not as a servant, but as someone seen. When the child was born, Abram named him Ishmael. He held the boy in his arms, his first son. And though he smiled, though the camp rejoiced, though the fire burned long that night, Sarai sat alone, watching from a distance, waiting still. When Hagar returned to the camp, the sun was low in the sky. The colours of dusk painted the tents in warm hues, and the wind carried the scent of smoke and sweet grass. She walked with slower steps now, her body tired, her spirit trembling. But she walked as someone seen. No one noticed her at first. The camp was busy. Herds were being drawn in. Fires lit. Children chased each other through patches of shade. But when she stepped past the olive trees near the edge of the settlement, one of the younger servants caught sight of her and gasped. "Hagar!" Voices rippled like a breeze through fabric. Within minutes, the news had reached the central tent. Sarai's hand froze where it had been weaving thread. Abram stood, steady but surprised. The people turned to their master, uncertain. But Abram only said one thing. Let her be. No one asked where she had gone. No one asked why she had come back. Because something in her eyes silenced the questions. Hagar didn't explain. She didn't have to. The wilderness had marked her, but not with shame, with peace. She returned to her duty slowly, carefully. She no longer moved with the quiet eagerness of a young servant, nor the proud stride of a woman carrying new life. Instead, she moved with the stillness of someone who had seen something vast and had been seen in return. Sarai avoided her eyes for days. When they passed in the tent or near the fires, Sarai would look just past her, hands full of tasks, voice calm but distant. But Hagar never stared back, never pressed, never sought approval. She only carried her child and her knowing. The months passed. The seasons began to turn, though the sun still burned high by midday and the night winds remained warm. Hagar grew heavy with child. Her face softened, her step slowed. The other women in the camp brought her food, rubbed her back, cooled her forehead. And still, she said little. Her tent remained near the outer edge, close enough for safety, far enough for solitude. Abram visited her only once during those months, just once. He brought bread and sat near the entrance. He asked if she was well. She nodded. He asked if she needed anything. She shook her head. Before he left, he looked at her for a long time. His eyes held sorrow, respect, and something else. Wonder. "Did he truly speak to you?" he asked. She met his gaze and replied only, "He saw me." He nodded and left. Then came the day of birth. It was quiet, unexpectedly so. No cries of agony, no shouts of fear, just the hum of women working together in the shade of a closed tent, and the slow, deep rhythm of life entering the world. When it was over, a child lay in Hagar's arms. Tiny, wrinkled, strong. He cried only once, then fell into sleep, and Hagar whispered his name. Ishmael. God hears. Abram held him that evening, for a long time. The firelight danced across his weathered face. His arms, strong from years of walking and lifting and leading, now cradled something impossibly small, something alive, something promised, but not the promise. He rocked gently, not in a rhythm to soothe the child, but to steady himself. Sarai watched from a distance. She did not interrupt. She did not come closer. She sat by her own fire, hands still, eyes bright, face unreadable. She loved Abram. She loved him enough to let him hold what wasn't hers. But in the quiet that followed, she pressed her hand to her own stomach, flat, unchanged, and whispered nothing at all. And yet, life continued. Ishmael grew. He learned to sit, to walk, to laugh. His voice echoed across the camp like a bell, clear and full. He followed the goats, pulled on Abram's robes, ran through fields with bare feet and dust-covered legs. He was loved. The servants watched over him. The men nodded when he passed. The women smiled, but he was also watched. Sarai's eyes followed him sometimes, longer than she meant to. She tried not to let it show. She tried to busy her hands, her thoughts, but his laughter often broke through. Not like a wound, not like joy, but something between. One night, long after the fires had dimmed and the tents had fallen silent, Sarai stood outside alone. The stars were soft above her, the moon only a sliver. The earth cooled beneath her bare feet, and then she spoke, not loud, not to anyone in the camp, just to the sky. You saw her. Her voice caught. See me too. And the sky did not answer, but it listened. Years passed quietly under the canopy of Mamre. Not silent years, but soft ones. Years without fire or thunder, without visions or voices, just the ordinary rhythm of living. The creak of tent fabric in the wind, the crunch of dry soil beneath feet, the low hum of sheep in the distance. Life settled into itself like a slow, steady breath. The promises spoken in earlier days did not vanish. They lingered, etched into the memory of Abram's spirit like carvings in stone. But they rested now, folded beneath routine, still present, but no longer pressing. His camp had grown, his livestock multiplied, his servants followed him with respect, and Ishmael, his son, had become the pulse of his days. The boy had his mother's eyes and Abram's determined chin. He ran through the camp with bare feet and dust-caked knees, shouting names of animals he had memorized and pointing to stars he could not yet count. He was wild in joy, loud in curiosity, and endlessly full of life. He walked beside Abram most days, learning to feed animals, to patch tents, to find clean water in dry places. He watched his father carefully, mimicking his posture, copying his words, even sitting quietly during his father's moments of prayer, though he didn't yet understand the meaning. To Abram, Ishmael was both son and student, shadow and sunrise. The boy brought laughter back into the camp, the kind that didn't sting, the kind that softened the years. And in his presence, Abram found a kind of peace he hadn't known he'd been missing. Perhaps, he thought, the waiting was over. Perhaps this boy of strength, this child of wilderness and wild joy, was the promise made visible. He didn't ask for more, not any more. He didn't press God for fulfillment or measure the distance between prophecy and present. He built no new altars. He uttered no more questions. The stars had spoken once. That was enough. He had learned to hold promise like a seed in the soil, quietly, patiently, without needing to see it bloom every day to believe it was still growing. But faith does not always wait quietly. Sometimes it stirs again, not from doubt, but from love. One afternoon, when the sun sat high above the camp and the animals dozed in scattered shade, the quiet broke, not with noise, but with presence. Abram felt it first, that subtle pressure in the chest, the sense that time had paused, the way the world suddenly felt still around him, even though the wind still moved and the camp still breathed. He turned his head, not in fear, but in recognition. The voice came as it always did, soft but unmistakable. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will confirm my covenant between us, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram bowed low, pressing his forehead to the earth. He did not speak. Dust clung to his face, but he did not move. The voice was not demanding. It was holy. It wrapped around him like light that could not be seen, but could be felt in every bone. Then came the words that unstitched his identity. You shall no longer be called Abram. The name hovered in the air one last time. Familiar, worn, noble. But now it would be laid down. Your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of many nations. The name fell like a seed into his spirit and took root. Abram had meant exalted father. Abraham meant father of many. It wasn't just a change of letters. It was a change of destiny. He remained on his knees. He let the name settle. It felt heavier, but not in a burdensome way. It was the weight of legacy, of generations not yet born, of voices he would never hear, shaped by this moment. Abraham breathed in deeply, and when he exhaled, something old left him. He would never be Abram again. Then the voice spoke again. And Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai anymore. Her name shall be Sarah. He repeated it in his mind. Sarah. It felt rounder, stronger, royal. Sarah shall bear you a son. Yes, I will bless her. She shall become a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Abraham's breath caught in his throat. He lifted his face just slightly from the ground, wide-eyed. A son, through Sarah. He was nearly 100 years old. She was 90. Surely God knew. Surely the heavens understood what time had taken. Abraham laughed, not in defiance, not in mockery, but in the helpless joy of being seen again. A son through Sarah, he whispered, shaking his head. And then, almost hesitantly, he added, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." He loved his boy, the child of the desert, the one who had walked beside him in silence and storm. And God, gracious and steady, answered, "I have heard you. I will bless Ishmael. He will become a great nation. He will be strong, fruitful, fierce. But your covenant, your line, will come through the son Sarah bears." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of awe, of promise, of names newly spoken. Abraham stood slowly, older now, but not weaker. He looked up at the sun and whispered both names aloud. Abraham, Sarah. They were promises. They were instructions. They were beginnings. That night, as the camp settled, Abraham returned to the tent. Sarah was grinding barley. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her brow lined from the heat, her hands strong with habit. She did not look up immediately when he entered. She was used to his quiet arrivals. They had learned the rhythm of each other's footsteps. He sat beside her and waited. She glanced up. "You're quiet." He nodded, and then said softly, "You have a new name." She paused. Her hands stopped moving. "What?" He smiled, not as a man telling a joke, but as one holding a treasure. "Sarah," he said. "Not Sarai anymore. Sarah. Because you will be the mother of nations." She stared at him. At first she said nothing. Then she laughed. Not because she didn't believe, but because believing hurt less when wrapped in wonder. The days following the covenant were filled with a stillness that wasn't silence. It was the kind of stillness that settles after thunder, after wind, after years of waiting. Abraham walked differently now, not with more pride, but with a deeper calm, like a man carrying something invisible in his chest. Not a burden, a knowing. He moved through the camp as he always had, checking on animals, speaking with herdsmen, helping children untangle cords or tie up goats. But Sarah noticed the difference. He smiled at odd moments. He stared at the sky longer, his lips forming words only he and heaven could hear. And when she asked what he was thinking, he would just say, "Soon," and nothing more. Sarah was not one for riddles. She had waited too long, crossed too many miles, buried too many tears in the folds of her robe to pretend she didn't feel the weight of time. Her laughter lines had deepened. Her hair, once black and braided, now streaked with threads of silver. But she still moved with grace. She still commanded the camp with one glance. She was Sarai no more, but Sarah. She had repeated the name to herself that first night, quietly, again and again. Sarah, a name given not by her father nor her husband, but by heaven itself. She didn't yet know what to do with it, but she wore it all the same. It was near midday when they came. 3 men. They appeared near the oaks of Mamre, where the land stretched open and the breeze rustled through the branches like voices whispering in an unseen language. Abraham looked up from where he sat at the entrance of his tent, and without a word, he rose. He ran to meet them, not walked, not nodded, but ran. He bowed low to the ground. He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. "Please," he said, "do not pass your servant by. Let water be brought to wash your feet. Rest under this tree. Let me bring food, and you may refresh yourselves before you go on your way." The strangers agreed. Abraham hurried back to the tent, his voice urgent but light. "Quick," he said to Sarah, "take fine flour, knead it, and bake some bread." She blinked at him, halfway through organizing herbs, then set everything aside and got to work. He ran to the herd, chose a tender calf, gave it to a servant to prepare. Curd, milk, meat. He set it all before the men under the shade of the trees, and he stood nearby as they ate, not hovering, but waiting, as one waits for a moment they can feel approaching. Sarah remained inside the tent near the entrance, just out of sight. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. She simply paused, bowl in hand, dough half mixed, and listened. Then one of them asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abraham replied without hesitation, "There in the tent." A pause. Then came the words that would change everything. "I will return to you this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." The spoon slipped from her hand and struck the bowl. It wasn't loud. No one outside noticed, but inside her, something cracked, softly. She stepped back, pressing a palm to her chest as if to hold something in place. A child. Her. Now. Her mouth opened before her mind had caught up, and she laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, not the kind that shakes walls or calls attention. It was a breathless sound, a sound of disbelief laced with tenderness, a sound that had waited in her throat for decades, a laugh not of mockery, but of exhaustion. "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, now I shall have pleasure?" She didn't say it to anyone. She said it to herself, because that's where her doubts had lived all along. Not in her words, but deep in her bones. Outside, one of the visitors looked toward the tent and spoke, not to Abraham, but to the silence behind the fabric. Why did Sarah laugh? Abraham turned his head. Sarah froze. The voice continued, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" Sarah panicked. She stepped closer to the edge of the tent and said quickly, "I did not laugh." But the voice, calm and steady, replied simply, "Oh, but you did." And then came the silence. A silence fuller than any noise. Inside her chest, something flickered. It wasn't shame. It wasn't fear. It was possibility. The kind so fragile it feels like grief. The kind so bright it hurts the eyes. The kind that dares you to believe again, after you've stopped hoping. That night, she lay beside Abraham, her back turned, her eyes wide. He reached for her hand beneath the blankets. She let him hold it. They said nothing, but when she closed her eyes, the words returned. Is anything too wonderful? And for the first time in years, Sarah began to wonder what it might feel like to laugh because of joy. Long after the strangers had finished eating, the scent of roasted meat still hung in the air. The empty bowls and broken bread lay scattered on the rugs beneath the oaks, and yet it felt like nothing had ended. Abraham stood near the table, hands at his sides, watching them. 3 men, or perhaps something more than men, rose from their places. Their movements were smooth, almost unhurried, and their eyes held no urgency. The air around them still pulsed with something he could not name. Not heat, not wind, just presence. Sarah had remained inside the tent the whole time. She hadn't come out, not even to refill a cup or clear a plate. She lingered just beyond the fabric wall, sitting now in thought, her fingers still touching the bowl she had dropped when she heard the words, "Next year, a son." She hadn't spoken since. Not to Abraham, not to herself, but something in her had stirred, and she, who had for so long mastered the art of waiting in silence, now found herself wrapped in a silence filled with questions. The visitors stepped past the tent and into the sun. Their robes brushed against the dry grass, their shadows stretching long across the earth. Abraham, as if moved by instinct, followed them. They said nothing at first. Neither did he. But he walked behind them, a few paces back, as they turned toward the southern ridge, the edge of the camp that opened toward the plains. Beyond that horizon lay Sodom. He knew where they were headed. When they reached the slope, one of them slowed. He turned, not in farewell, but with an expression that asked something deeper. "Will you come further?" Abraham nodded. He did not need words. And so they walked together, the elder shepherd and the eternal travelers, their feet stirring dust from the ancient ground, their silence full of weight. Then the Lord spoke, not aloud, but within Abraham's chest. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" The words struck him like thunder inside the ribs, loud and soft, startling and still. The voice continued, "He will become a great and mighty nation. All the nations of the earth shall be blessed through him, for I have chosen him, that he may instruct his children to keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice." Then came the reason for the walk. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very grave. I will go down and see whether what they have done is as bad as the cry that has come to me. Abraham lowered his head. Sodom. He had heard the stories, whispers from travelers, shouts from shepherds who returned shaken. He had seen the eyes of those who passed through, hollow, hurried, unwilling to say what they'd seen. And he thought of Lot, his nephew, his blood, who had once chosen the green land because it looked easy, because it looked like promise. Lot was there now, with his family, with his home, and judgment was walking toward them. Abraham stepped forward, his voice unsteady, but full of courage that love had grown. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" It was not a challenge, it was a plea. "What if there are 50 righteous within the city? Will you then destroy the place and not spare it for the 50? The pause felt eternal. Then the Lord answered, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham took a slow breath, and then, almost shyly, he asked again, "What about 45? then 40, then 30, 20, 10. Each time, the Lord's reply came back calm and firm. I will not destroy it. It wasn't just justice. It was mercy. Mercy shaped like patience. Mercy big enough to pause wrath for the sake of 10. And then there were no more questions. Just stillness. Abraham stood on the ridge, watching the figures move toward the horizon, their shapes blurring in the heat, their forms flickering like flame. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to, because some part of Abraham already knew. He had not just hosted men. He had stood in the presence of something eternal. He remained there long after the sun began to fall. The shadows of the oaks stretched far behind him. The camp below began to flicker with evening fires. The goats wandered in for the night. Voices of children floated up on the wind. But Abraham did not turn back right away. He thought of Sarah, still inside, still holding that question in her chest. He thought of Ishmael, still full of laughter, still the only son he had ever held. He thought of Lot, still in Sodom, still unaware of how close the fire was. And he thought of the words that would not stop ringing in his mind. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? When he finally returned to camp, the stars had begun to appear overhead. He didn't speak, not even to Sarah. But in the quiet of their tent, he held her hand in the dark. And together, without a word, they both listened to a silence that still echoed with promise. Justice does not always roar. It sometimes weeps. The sun rose slowly the next morning, as if it too had heard the whispers. Abraham stood at the edge of the ridge before the camp had stirred. The air was cool, the grass damp with dew. A hush hung over the trees. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. He looked to the south, beyond the hills, beyond the trees, beyond what the eye could easily see. Sodom was out there, still standing perhaps, still unaware, still breathing, but not for long. He said nothing to Sarah as she moved through the tent behind him. She lit the morning fire, stirred flour into water, began preparing bread like she always did. Life, for the moment, went on. But Abraham didn't move. He stood with one hand resting on a low branch of an oak, watching the horizon. The sky was too still, the wind too light. A pause, a breath, like the world itself was holding back tears. Far away, past the dry valleys and the rocky paths and the salt hills, Lot was waking too. Not to stillness, but to urgency. The messengers had come to him in the night. They had pulled him from dreams with warnings. They had told him to flee. Now without hesitation, without looking back. And so, as Abraham stared across a quiet land, Lot was running. Not because he wanted to, but because something deep in his bones told him this was not a warning he could wait to understand. The sun crept higher. Its light broke the mist in bands of gold and pale fire. And then it began. It didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with color. Smoke, dark and thick, began to bloom on the edge of the southern sky, like ink spreading through water. It rose slowly at first, a single column, winding upward like a question. Then another, then more. The ground didn't shake. No thunder cracked, but Abraham felt it, in the soles of his feet, in the hollow of his chest, a heaviness, a grief, as if the land itself was mourning. Fire came next. It didn't fall in streaks. It didn't roar. It descended like a judgment too tired to shout. The sky turned bronze, then ash, and where once the fertile plains of Sodom had stretched green and wide, there was now flame. Low at first, then leaping, devouring houses, gates, altars, markets, and people. Abraham watched, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with sorrow. He remembered the laughter of Lot, the arguments they once had over land, the way he used to walk with his uncle, trying to match his stride. He remembered the tents they once shared, the morning bread, the small boy who had grown into a man with too much to prove and not enough time to learn how. And now, only smoke. The wind changed direction. It carried the scent of ash. Abraham turned his face away. He did not look out again until the sun had nearly reached its peak. By then, the horizon was a smudge of shadow and flame. The cities were no longer visible, just heat and dust and rising grief. He did not know if Lot had escaped. He would not know for some time. But in his heart, he carried a hope so fragile, he dared not speak it aloud. Perhaps the Lord had remembered mercy. Perhaps the angels had lingered. Perhaps 10 had not been found. But 1 had been spared. He returned to the tent slowly. The camp had stirred now. Children chased each other near the outer fires. Sarai was weaving again, her fingers moving with practiced calm. She looked up as he entered. He shook his head. She said nothing, but her eyes understood. That evening, when the fires were lit and the goats penned, Abraham stood once more beneath the oaks. He looked to the stars. They were quiet tonight, still there, still burning, still counting. And in the silence, he prayed. Not with words, not with promises. Just breathe, just presence, just pain, and trust. Because even when justice falls, God remembers the ones who wait. And the fire that ends one story can still light the beginning of another. The season shifted. The air warmed with gentler winds. The trees at Mamre rustled with a softer song. Flowers returned to the hillsides, bursting in pale yellows and dusky purples. The herds grew restless with new life, and in the quiet hum of a slowly waking earth, something began to stir in Sarah that hadn't stirred in decades. At first, she said nothing. She moved slower, slept longer. She told herself it was nothing, told herself her age had caught up to her at last. But then she felt it, deep inside, a rhythm not her own, a flutter, a push, life. She didn't believe it, not fully, not yet. Even as her stomach began to change, even as her feet swelled and her sleep grew heavy, she kept a piece of doubt tucked in her sleeve. Because it had been too long. Because promises that wait that long start to feel like stories. But she remembered the visitor, the voice through the fabric of the tent, the question he left behind. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? And now, her body answered. Abraham noticed before she spoke. He saw it in the way she rested her hand on her stomach when she didn't think anyone was watching. The way her breathing changed when she worked. The way she seemed, quietly, different. He didn't ask. He waited. Until one morning, she looked at him from across the fire and smiled with tears on her cheeks. And he knew. They told no one at first. Not out of secrecy, but reverence. Like something holy had made its way into their tent, and to speak of it too soon might cause it to disappear. So they carried the joy quietly between them, like a glowing ember in their cupped hands. But joy, true joy, does not stay hidden. The camp began to sense it. The servants whispered. The women watched. Children tiptoed near her tent with questions they didn't dare ask aloud. Sarah began to laugh again, and this time not to hide disbelief, but because the impossible had finally knocked on her door. When the child came, It was not in thunder or pain or cries of terror. It was simple, a morning like any other. The sun rose soft. The birds sang their usual song. And in the center tent, under a woven canopy, and with Abraham holding her hand, Sarah gave birth. No midwives from the city, no priests, no incense. Just breathe, just life, just a baby's cry, and the sound of an old woman weeping with joy. They named him Isaac, which means laughter, because Sarah had laughed when she heard the promise, because Abraham had laughed when he heard it again, because now God had laughed with them. The camp rejoiced. Voices lifted. Drums patted gently into the night. Neighbors from neighboring hills arrived with gifts. Dates, wool, cloth dyed in blue. Fires burned longer. Wine flowed. And in the middle of it all sat Sarah, older than any mother they had ever known, holding her child and grinning at the stars. She whispered to herself, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And she laughed again. But this time, everyone laughed with her. Sometimes joy divides what sorrow once held together. Time passed, but not the kind of time that rushes, the kind that drips like honey. Isaac grew, small and warm and loud with newness. His giggles echoed across the tents, his tiny feet padding unevenly through the sand. Wherever Abraham went, Isaac followed, gripping his father's hand with sticky fingers, tugging at his robe, pointing to birds, stars, bugs. Everything was new to him. And through his eyes, everything became new to Abraham as well. Sarah changed too, not in the lines of her face, but in the softness behind her smile, in the way she stopped what she was doing, whatever it was, whenever Isaac reached for her. She would drop the bread, forget the fire, leave a conversation unfinished, just to pick him up and press her face to his. To Sarah, the world began and ended in that boy's laughter. But not every corner of the camp laughed. Ishmael watched. He was older now, nearly grown, a teenager with strong shoulders and calloused palms. His face carried both his mother's sharpness and Abraham's steadiness. He helped with the herds, carried buckets, split firewood. The servants respected him. Some followed him when Abraham wasn't looking. He was the firstborn, the elder. But now, he was also the other. He noticed the shift before anyone said a word. How Abraham looked a little longer at Isaac. How Sarah's tent, once open to him, now closed earlier at night. How Isaac was carried more than walked. How people smiled differently when he passed. He said nothing, but the silence grew. Hagar knew it too. She said little, but her eyes never stopped moving. She had raised Ishmael in the shadows of hope deferred. She had sung to him alone, bathed him without fanfare, watched him grow beside a promise that didn't belong to her. And now, the promise had a name, had feet, had curls like Sarah's, and the kind of future Hagar could never give her son. She held Ishmael tighter. He pulled away more often now, not because he didn't love her, but because he was beginning to understand. The day of Isaac's weaning was meant to be a celebration. A feast was prepared, rugs laid out beneath the shade, figs, goat cheese, bread dipped in oil, pitchers of sweet wine. Servants gathered, musicians played, and in the center of it all, Isaac, now steady on his feet, ran clumsily between guests, arms open, grinning. Sarah stood nearby, proud and glowing. Abraham toasted. He lifted his cup and spoke words of joy, of destiny, of the God who keeps promises even when the years say otherwise. And then, amid the laughter and music, Sarah's eyes caught a movement. Across the yard, Ishmael laughed. Not the light kind, but the kind that curls slightly at the edge. A mocking laugh. Just a breath. Just a glance. But enough. He was watching Isaac, watching the boy stumble over his own feet and giggle at the fall. And Ishmael laughed. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. But to Sarah, it sounded like fracture. She stepped back. She said nothing during the feast. But when the plates were cleared and the guests had gone, she turned to Abraham. Her voice was quiet, but unshakable. Cast out this slave woman and her son. Abraham froze. Sarah didn't blink. She wasn't angry. She was resolved. For the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. The silence that followed was sharp. Abraham turned away, walked to the edge of the tent, gripped a post, breathed once. This was his son, his first, the one who had made him a father, the one who had walked beside him all these years, the one he loved. But Sarah's words rang louder than her voice. This wasn't jealousy. This wasn't rivalry. This was covenant. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat beside the fire long after the camp had gone still. Isaac was tucked beside Sarah, dreaming. Hagar was quiet in her own corner of the tents. Ishmael slept under the stars, as he often did. And Abraham prayed. Not with eloquence, not with clarity, just longing. And the voice came again. Do not be displeased because of the boy, or because of your servant. Abraham's heart ached. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He looked up. But I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. When the sun rose, Abraham rose with it. He walked to Hagar's tent in silence, carried water, bread. She looked at him and knew. No words, just tears. She wrapped her son's blanket, held his hand, and left. When all hope runs dry, and heaven opens its eyes, morning did not come gently. It broke over the tents like a slow tear through cloth. Pale light spilled across the camp at Mamre, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold finality of what was about to happen. The ground, once a resting place for generations, now felt like a dividing line. There would be no negotiations, no changed minds, no last-minute words. Abraham stood at the edge of the camp, hunched slightly forward, as if the air itself had grown too heavy. His face, lined and worn, held an expression that was neither anger nor fear, but something deeper. Grief layered over obedience, memory pressing against duty. The skin of water in his hand seemed absurd in the morning sun. Just one, as if you could carry provision for a lifetime in a vessel that would barely last a day. In the other hand, a sack of bread, flat, thin loaves, enough for, how long? A few days maybe. But this was not about food. This was about surrender. Hagar stood nearby, head held high. She did not cry. Not yet. Her shoulders, broad from years of labor and survival, remained firm. But her eyes betrayed her. They were bright, not with anger, but with the ache of dignity forced to walk alone. She had dressed early, before the camp stirred, before Sarah's voice could reach her again. She wrapped her son's blanket herself, rolled it tightly, tied it with cloth. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if speed might make it real, as if gentleness could make it untrue. Ishmael stood beside her, tall now, nearly grown, a young man already shaped by silence and wandering eyes. His mother had taught him well, to speak little, to observe much. He had been the firstborn son of a promise that had since shifted direction, and now he was the one sent away. He said nothing. He looked at Abraham just once, a brief flickering glance, not filled with hatred, but with confusion, with hurt, with farewell. Abraham stepped forward, face hollow. He didn't know what to say. He had rehearsed words all night, but now they vanished. "I'm sorry," sounded small. "It's God's will," felt too distant. So he said nothing. He only handed the skin of water to Hagar, placed the bread in her hands. Their fingers brushed. Just for a second. Enough. Enough to say all the things they couldn't. And then she turned and didn't look back. The wilderness didn't greet them. It consumed them. There were no paths, no trees, no signs of welcome, just heat and dust. The sun climbed with a vengeance, as if angry that two more had dared enter its territory without offering. At first, they walked quickly, needing distance, needing to be gone before doubt crept in. But by midday, their pace slowed. Their sandals kicked up more dust than forward momentum. Ishmael kept walking ahead, shoulders set. Hagar watched him, and every so often, she turned to look behind them, not toward Mamre, but toward the life that no longer included them. She had no map, only memory, and memory was no compass at all. The water was rationed, carefully, sips, measured, precious. At night, they shared a single blanket. Hagar wrapped it around Ishmael while she lay curled at his feet. He protested. She insisted. He was the future. Her job was to protect it. But by the third day, protection no longer looked like blankets. It looked like shade, which they didn't have. It looked like hope, which was fading. The skin of water, once the object of her obsession, now hung limp and light at her side. Ishmael stumbled that morning. Hagar caught him, just in time. He tried to wave her off. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. His lips had cracked. His face was pale beneath the tan. His strength had left him silently in the night. They kept walking anyway, because there was no choice. Then, around midday, he fell. Not dramatically. He simply stopped walking, sat down, then slumped forward, and didn't rise. Hagar panicked quietly. She called his name. Once, twice, no response. His chest still moved, but slower now. Barely. She dragged him beneath a stunted bush, the only one she could find. Its shadow was hardly wider than her arm, but it was something. She placed his head against her knees, held his face. He whispered something, but it made no sense. And that's when she stood and stepped away. She didn't leave him, not really. She walked about a bow shot away, far enough that she wouldn't hear his breath stop, far enough that she wouldn't see his eyes dull. She collapsed to the ground and screamed. It wasn't a scream anyone would hear, except one. Her cry was not eloquent, not polite. It wasn't shaped for psalms. It was a mother's cry, ragged, desperate, final. "Let me not see the boy die." That was all she said, and even that, she whispered into the dirt. Then, stillness, and then a voice. "Hagar." She sat up, her hair stuck to her face. Her lips were shaking. "Do not be afraid." The voice wrapped around her like water before the well was seen. "God has heard the voice of the boy, where he is." She gasped. Her eyes scanned the horizon, desert in every direction. But the voice kept speaking. Lift up the boy, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. And then she saw it, a shimmer, not in the distance, right there, a well. It had been there the whole time, hidden, or maybe revealed. She ran, filled the skin with shaking hands, ran back, lifted Ishmael, held his mouth open, poured water in. He coughed, coughed again, drank, and then opened his eyes. They didn't speak, they just sat there, in the shadow of a bush, at the edge of dying, alive, together. Time passed. They did not return to Mamre. They did not look back. Hagar found a place, a stretch of wilderness where her son could become something more than forgotten. He grew, strong, resilient, a man of the wild. He learned to hunt, to track the stars, to live with the wind, and God was with him. Hagar watched him with wonder. Every year, he looked more like his father. Every year, he needed her less, but she remained. And every now and then, when the heat shimmered against the rocks and the sky turned that strange evening blue, she would lift her eyes and remember the day she was seen and her son was heard. Some promises are tested on mountaintops no one wants to climb. The days had been full of peace. Since Isaac's birth, Abraham and Sarah's tents had brimmed with the kind of joy that silences old aches. The boy had grown quickly, running barefoot among the sheep, chasing birds with laughter like bells. His hands were always reaching, always pointing, always searching for the edges of the world. He asked many questions. Why does the wind move? How do the stars stay up? Why does a ram have horns? Abraham answered with smiles, with stories, with patience. But one question he never expected to hear came from beyond his son. It came from heaven. One morning, soft, still, ordinary, the voice came again, not like thunder, just there. Abraham. He froze. His fingers stopped mid-motion as he folded a cloth. The breath in his chest paused. I am here. And then the words came, quiet but heavy. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac. Abraham's hand gripped the cloth tighter. Go to the land of Moriah. The name echoed like a place half remembered, yet never seen. And offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you. Everything inside Abraham collapsed and expanded at once. There was no mistaking what he had heard. There was no room for metaphor, no parable to hide inside. Take your son, the one who had been promised, the one who came after decades of silence, the one whose very name meant laughter, and offer him as a sacrifice. He didn't speak, not to Sarah, not even to himself. He woke early the next morning, long before the light, packed wood, sharpened a blade, saddled a donkey, called for 2 servants. Then, in the quiet, he roused Isaac. The boy blinked, sleepy, smiled. Are we going on a journey? Yes, Abraham whispered, a very important one. And he did not cry. They walked for 3 days. 3 days of silence stitched between small talk. Isaac asked about clouds, about the shape of mountains. Abraham nodded, answered when he could, pretended to study the path ahead. But his eyes were turned inward. Every step felt like rebellion. Every mile a betrayal. Every hour, he asked himself, is this truly what God has asked? But the silence from heaven remained. Not cold, just quiet, trusting him to walk. On the 3rd day, he saw it. A shape in the distance, A mountain. It didn't look like death. It looked ordinary. A rise of stone. A stretch of earth. But Abraham knew. He turned to the servants. "Stay here," he said. "The boy and I will go and worship. Then we will return." He used the word "we," not as a lie, but as a prophecy. He placed the wood on Isaac's back, carried the fire himself, and the knife. They walked together, father and son, up a mountain where promises come to die. Halfway up, Isaac turned. "Father." Abraham's throat clenched. "Yes, my son. We have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb?" Silence. The question hung in the air like a blade. Then Abraham said, "God will provide," and kept walking. At the summit, the world fell quiet. The wind slowed. Even the birds did not sing. Abraham built the altar stone by stone. His hands shook, but he placed each one with care. Not rushing, not delaying, just faithful. Isaac watched, uncertain, quiet, until Abraham turned. Eyes full of sorrow and something deeper, something Isaac didn't yet understand. Abraham took the boy's hands, tied them, laid him on the altar. Isaac did not scream. He trusted, even as tears ran down his cheeks, even as his father's hand lifted the blade. And Abraham, heart breaking, mind spinning, lungs collapsing, lifted his eyes and brought the knife down, but the voice stopped him. "Abraham, Abraham." He gasped, dropped the blade mid-air. "I am here," he cried. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham fell to his knees. He wept like a man finally allowed to feel again. And then he saw it. A ram, caught in a thicket, struggling, waiting. He untied Isaac, held him longer than the moment needed. Then, with shaking hands, he offered the ram instead. Smoke rose from the altar, but it was not the smoke of sorrow. It was the smoke of surrender, of obedience, of faith. They named the place Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Because on the mountain of unthinkable loss, God had shown up. What begins with surrender ends with starlight. They came down the mountain like men who had crossed something more than terrain. It wasn't fatigue in Abraham's body that slowed his pace. It was reverence. Each step felt lighter now, not because the burden was gone, but because it had been understood. There was no more terror, no more asking why. The question had already been answered in the space between blade and breath. God had spoken, and more than that, God had stayed. Isaac, walking a few quiet steps behind his father, was changed too. Something in his boyish manner had tempered. He didn't ask questions, didn't chase goats or toss pebbles at the birds. His eyes scanned the horizon differently now, as if searching for what his soul had just glimpsed. He had lain on the altar. He had felt the ropes. He had seen the sun flash against steel in his father's trembling hand. And he had seen it stop. Love had held the knife, but obedience had lifted it. And now he knew something most grown men would never understand. That trust, real trust, is sometimes forged in fire, and sometimes in silence. When the trees of Mamre came into view, familiar and waving in the late wind, Sarah stood at the edge of the camp, eyes narrowed against the sun. She had waited for 3 days and 3 nights, each moment growing heavier in her chest. She knew they had gone to worship, but she also knew the ache of a mother who had waited too long for a son to take anything for granted. When she saw Isaac, whole, walking, dust-covered and smiling faintly, her breath left her. She didn't run. She walked fast and silent toward him, wrapped him in her arms, buried her face in his neck, and said nothing. Just held. Isaac, for the first time in his young life, let his mother hold him longer than necessary. Abraham stood nearby, watching the reunion. His hands were still stained with ash. He said nothing. But when Sarah looked over Isaac's shoulder and met his gaze, she saw everything in his eyes. The climb, the fear, the surrender, and the miracle. And she knew. She didn't speak it aloud. Some stories are too sacred for early retelling. That night, they did not celebrate. There was no feast, no announcement, just the gentle return to quiet. Bread was passed, fires were kindled, the wind sang through the branches of the oaks. But in the stillness, something had shifted. Abraham had been given back what he thought he would lose. And not just a son, but the deep knowing that he could trust the voice in the silence, even when it asks the unthinkable. When the camp fell asleep, Abraham stepped away. Out beyond the goats, beyond the firelight, beyond the hum of breath and dreaming tents. He walked until the night wrapped around him completely. And there, he looked up. The stars had returned. They shimmered above him as they had decades ago, back when he was a younger man, confused, barefoot, still listening to a God he had only just met. Back then, he didn't know what the stars meant, only that they were many, and that somehow they were his. Now he understood. Each one a name, a future, a laugh, a child, a nation. He dropped to one knee, not out of exhaustion, but because his legs knew what his spirit had finally grasped. The story wasn't just about him. It never had been. It was about the generations. And he, dust-covered, childless once, obedient still, was just the first stone in the river, the one that breaks the current so the rest can flow. Then the voice came again. Not booming, not distant, close, closer than breath. Because you have done this, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. The stars pulsed. The desert held its breath. I will multiply your descendants, as the stars in the sky, as the sand beneath your feet. And through your seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you obeyed my voice. Abraham bowed low, pressed his hands into the sand, the same sand that now passed through his fingers, grain after grain, too many to count, and the sky above him endless, burned with promises older than he could comprehend. He was no longer the beginning. He was the bridge. As the wind whispered through the night shrubs, Abraham whispered back, I believe you. It was not a vow, it was a conclusion. Faith does not fade with age. It ripens, softens, and finally rests. The final years came slowly, not because they dragged, but because they no longer rushed. There was no urgent call from heaven now. No fire on mountaintops, no messengers at the door. Only the quiet rhythm of days lived in full. Abraham no longer wandered. His journeys had already taken him across deserts, through promises, beneath stars, and up a mountain where heaven had paused his hand. Now his path was smaller. He walked among trees, tended sheep with slow hands, listened to birds that returned with each spring, and watched Isaac become a man. Each morning, he woke before the sun, not because of habit, but because he loved the hush that came just before light. He would sit by the tent's edge, feel the dew through the fabric underfoot, and remember Haran. Ulika. The first time he heard that impossible voice say, "Go," he had gone. And now he was still. People came and went. Strangers passed through with stories and salt. Abraham offered them water, bread, shade. He no longer needed to tell them who he was. He had nothing to prove. When they asked about the stars, he simply smiled. Sarah remained beside him for many seasons. She aged beautifully, though not without wear. Her hands, once strong enough to lift tent poles, now trembled slightly as she tied the morning bread. But her eyes, they remained fierce. She laughed less, but when she did, it filled the camp like sunlight. They sat together in the evenings, no longer filling the silence with plans or names of unborn children. They simply sat. The world had already given them the child they were promised, and taken from them the child they had surrendered. They spoke often of Isaac. They rarely spoke of Ishmael, but his name was never far from their hearts. When Sarah passed, it was not a storm, it was a sigh. She lay down one warm afternoon beneath the oaks, and her body simply decided, this is enough. Abraham sat beside her long after the breath left her. He didn't weep loudly. His grief was deeper than tears. It was folded into his bones. A familiar guest, come once again to visit. He buried her himself, purchased the field, marked the cave, spoke the words to the Hittites with steady voice. When it was done, he sat at the entrance and watched the sun disappear. Isaac stayed close in those days. He tended to his father's quiet, walked with him when the silence grew too wide, asked small questions, not about God, but about earth. How do I know when the wheat is ready? Why does a fig tree bend? Abraham answered slowly, not because he didn't know, but because he had learned the value of stillness between words. At night, Isaac watched him, how his father stared at the stars, not counting anymore, but remembering. Remembering that long ago night when he was younger, and the voice had said, "Count them, if you can." Now he didn't try, because the stars had already come. One in the next tent, others he trusted would follow. Abraham grew thin, not weak, just worn in, like leather softened by time. He laughed with children who came near the camp, told stories with few words, held the hand of every servant who had grown up under his gaze. He did not speak of altars anymore, nor angels, nor fire. He spoke of trust and of joy that sometimes arrives too late for the young to appreciate, but just in time for the old to cherish. Then one night, he asked to sleep outside, under the stars, not in a bed, not in his tent, just under sky. Isaac laid a mat for him, brought him a blanket. They said little, but as Isaac turned to leave, Abraham reached for his hand, held it, looked into the face of the boy he had once bound with rope, and now unbound with blessing. "I waited so long for you," he said. Isaac smiled. "And I'm still here," he replied. Abraham chuckled, software tired, then whispered, "So is he." That night, he did not stir. The stars blinked above him. The wind curled gently around the mat. The fire near the tent burned low. And Abraham rested, not like sleep, but like return, as if the journey had circled back, as if the voice he first heard in had never stopped speaking, only waited for him to finish listening. When the sun rose, he did not. Isaac found him beneath the sky, eyes closed, face calm, mouth tilted into something just shy of a smile. He touched his father's shoulder, cold, still, present. He buried him beside Sarah, in the cave, in the field he had bought, among the oaks, and he told no one what his father had said the night before, because some things are meant to be held, not repeated. Years later, when Isaac sat by the same tree, his own son in his lap, he pointed to the stars, and he said, "Let me tell you about a man who counted these once." And the story began again.